Welcome everyone to Better Feeds, Algorithms that Put People First. My name is Alyssa Cooper, and I'm the Executive Director of the Knight-Georgetown Institute. We're so excited to welcome you today to talk about a piece of work that we published earlier this month, which is a how-to guide for policymakers and platforms who want to improve the algorithmic feeds that we all experience online. Next slide, please. So just some quick logistics for our session today. The how-to guide is available on the Knight-Georgetown Institute website, and this meeting is being recorded. The recording will be available on our website as well, and the slides are also already available there. If you visit kgi.georgetown.edu, it's linked right there from the homepage, so you should be able to find both the report and the slides pretty easily if you want to follow along. Please add your questions as we go throughout to the Q&A panel in the Zoom webinar interface, and we're hoping to reserve a few minutes at the end for questions. If you need any help throughout the webinar, if you're having trouble getting connected, feel free to email us at kgi-media@georgetown.edu, or you can send a message in the chat, and our whole team at KGI will be able to assist you. So our agenda today comes in 4 parts. I'm going to give a quick overview of the policy landscape that led us to do this work on Better Feeds. My colleague Matt Modal is going to give everyone a quick Recommender Systems 101 and a little bit of an education about how we can make these feeds better. I'm going to walk us through the policy guidance, which is the core of the Better Feeds report, and then we'll have some time at the end for question and answer. Just a quick note about the Knight-Georgetown Institute for those who might not be familiar. KGI is a new center at Georgetown University whose mission is to connect independent research with technology policy and design focused on the online information environment. One of the main things that we do is research translation. And one way that we operationalize that is by convening groups of experts who have a diversity of experience across academia, industry, civil society, journalism, and practitioner communities to do this research synthesis with us and to identify how we can translate that research into a policy context. And this work product that we're talking about today is the product of one of those working groups. If we look at the next slide. Our expert working group on recommender systems, which really brought together an extremely distinguished cohort of experts in technology, in policy, in law, crossing many different disciplines. And we've just been really gratified to be able to work with this amazing group of experts. I will be joined today on the webinar, as I said, by my colleague Matt Modal, who is joining us from the Psychology of Technology Institute at the University of Southern California. So I'm going to kick us off by talking a little bit about the policy landscape that led us to do this work. And we'll start by talking about what's going on in the US. So as we look across technology and efforts to regulate technology in the United States, we've seen over the past couple of years a huge groundswell of interest in online algorithms. And that interest comes from a variety of different directions. Some folks who are concerned about online harms to children and teen and youth, others who have different concerns about content they see online about extremism or polarization or potential for bias. Whatever the issue that is bringing people to the table, we're seeing a tremendous amount of activity in the policy sphere, and in particular at the state level. So if we look across 2023 and 2024, there were over 75 bills introduced at the state level across 35 different states, trying in some way to address social media algorithms. And if we add the ones that have been introduced in 2025, my guess would be we'd be getting close up to 100 bills there. So there's a tremendous amount of interest and lots of different approaches being taken. Some of these bills focus more on transparency or deceptive patterns, user choices and defaults. There's a real variety out there. We're also seeing a tremendous amount of activity in litigation. So there's over 500 active lawsuits now brought by children, families, school districts, and others, alleging a variety of different algorithmic harms against online platforms. So that's the situation in the US. If we look globally, this phenomenon is not confined to the United States. Lots of policymaker interest in this topic from other jurisdictions as well. And perhaps taking the lead there is the European Union. So the Digital Services Act is a landmark regulation that came into force in 2023. And it has a variety of different provisions that address algorithms or recommender systems online, focusing on transparency, accountability, sort of woven into part of the risk assessment process that's required by the DSA. And there's a specific article in particular, Article 38, which applies only to very large online platforms and very large online search engines, that specifically requires these services to offer recommender systems with an option to not be profiled. So at least one option where the user isn't being profiled in the design of the recommender system. So just an example from outside the US. Next slide. And really what we see when we look across all of this activity and what led us to want to put this report together was something emerging that appears to be a false choice. And that choice is between the algorithms that we have today, which in many cases might be sort of attention maximizing or attempting to engage the user as much as possible, and that we see policymakers responding to that. And then on the other hand, that what we have are either chronological feeds or non-personalized feeds. And this example from a bill that was introduced in Oklahoma a couple of years ago is a good example, the Oklahoma Social Media Transparency Act, which would have required that platforms offer a way for users to opt out of certain prioritization that recommender systems do in order specifically to allow sequential or chronological posts. So sort of putting chronological feeds on a pedestal and saying that's the other option. If we're not taking the algorithms that we have today and the way they're designed today, we're going to go for this chronological feed. And you saw it in some of the reporting about some of these bills and laws as well. Like it's either the algorithms we have today or nothing, and we're going to glimpse what the world looks like on the other side of algorithms. And it turns out that when you look at the existing research, sorry, I'm not ready to move on yet. When you look at the existing research into how these systems are designed, whether it be for social media, for search, for e-commerce, for gaming, for any variety of other platforms, that there's actually a vast design space in between these two options. It's not actually the case that these algorithms are either designed to maximize your attention or they have to be chronological or totally non-personalized. There's many other choices in between. And what we really wanted to do with this work was to show a roadmap for how we can incentivize and promote all those other designs that put the user first, but aren't necessarily so simple that they just bar personalization or they require a chronological feed. And that's really what led us to do this work, and we're really excited to share it with everyone today. Now I'm going to kick it over to Matt, who's going to explain to us how these systems work and how we can make them better.
Thanks, Alyssa. Next slide, please. Okay, so recommender systems, they are complex algorithms that generate social media feeds that are familiar to all of us. Now, I could go into excruciating detail on how they work and all the calculus that goes into them, but I'll spare you. Unless, of course, someone forgets to mute themselves, or maybe people don't ask any good questions when we get to the Q&A at the end. The punishment will be calculus, so consider yourself warned. At a high level, we use algorithms to sort through the massive number of items that a user could see upon opening a social media platform or even a search engine. Items could be anything on that platform. User-generated content, posts, pictures, videos, comments, surveys, ads, you name it. Could be even this webinar, for example. platforms have many billions, maybe even trillions of items that they could be recommending to you, but almost all of those items would not be of interest to you. These recommendation systems try to filter out the items that are unlikely to be of interest to you, and conceptually they operate in 4 basic stages. So first, they try to reduce the total volume of eligible items by filtering out those that might violate the company's policies or be against the company's interests or against platform policies to protect users. And then in the next phase, the system will try to identify items that have a higher potential to be worth showing to users. Now, what is worth showing to users depends heavily on the platform and its business interest, but I'll go into a little more detail on that in a moment. Next, the next stage is where each of these items in the smaller but still very large pool of potential items is given a numeric score intended to capture how valuable or how worthwhile it would be to show a given item or a piece of content to a user in that given context. Then these items are sorted based on this numeric score. The final stage, before actually showing the top scoring content to users, is re-ranking these items to adhere to other goals. For example, platforms may not want to show you 5 news stories in a row. So the second stage of ranking may shuffle the high scoring content so that it's less repetitive, and then this content will appear in that order for that user. Now, you might be wondering, well, what is value or what is worthwhile? In many cases, value is something that ladders up to financial gain for the company that owns the platform. Commonly, user engagement is used to infer item value. Next slide, please. Engagement is simply the actions the user takes on the platform. It could be clicks, likes, comments, shares, watch time, or anything else that people can do on those platforms. Now, the companies that run these platforms, they like these metrics because they're very concrete indicators that map onto how many ads they can show people or how much data they're able to collect from someone. And those are things that can map up to a particular monetary value or financial incentive for the company. Additionally, these behaviors are plentiful. The total user base can engage in many of these behaviors on basically all of the content. And while almost nobody will see even a tiny slice of that content, many people will see much of the content and then provide these behavioral signals telling the company, oh, if people like this, they tend to click on or like or comment or reshare this kind of content. And with that behavioral data, these companies have plenty of information on which they could use to train these algorithmic recommendation systems to essentially inform the way that these like the ranking approach works, where it's like, okay, we think that people will engage with this, so we will give this content a higher score when evaluating it relative to things that or pieces of content that people are less likely to click on or engage with. Now, there's a problem with this, though, and we sometimes call this the potato chip problem. Could you move to the next slide? Thank you. Now, imagine you're at a party and there's a bowl of potato chips in front of you. Before you know it, you have eaten nearly all of the chips. Would your host be right to conclude that you really enjoy chips and they should refill the bowl? Possibly. Perhaps you really love them and want more. Or perhaps you want the host to save you from yourself, and you're hoping that they will put the bowl somewhere else, even as they are in the process of refilling it. Moreover, the answer might well be food dependent. Perhaps you would want your host to refill the bowl with, say, salad or anything but chips, maybe even something healthier. But you're really hoping that they don't refill that bowl with more chips right in front of you. Now, there are two key points that I want to highlight in this example. One is that your behavior doesn't match your preferences. So you end up eating way more chips than you'd probably like to. And then two, the host might mistakenly interpret your behavior of eating all the chips as a sign that you really need more chips and they should serve you more chips. When it comes to many recommendation systems, these systems, they often will misinterpret consuming and engaging with content as an indicator that they should serve you more of that content. That could be fine if people are more drawn to healthy, informative content than they were harmful or train wreck like content, but they are not. Next slide. So I don't have to, I certainly don't have the time to go into all of the detail on the volumes of research showing harms that are associated with this engagement-based approach to recommendation systems. There's plenty of research, both from independent academics and think tanks, and then also from the companies themselves, that shows that people are disproportionately likely to engage with content that is more harmful and even stuff that they say that they don't want or that they don't like. And these platforms essentially see you consuming this piece of misinformation or toxicity or engaging with somebody that's posted something that you don't like. And they're like, oh, they don't know that you don't like it, but they see that you are clicking on it, you're spending time hovering over it, watching it, maybe sharing it. And it doesn't even matter if you're calling out misinformation, saying, oh, no, here's the fact check, and here are all the reasons why sharing what you're sharing or sharing what the original post was is problematic or incorrect. All the platform sees is, oh, they're spending more time with this post. Oh, they log out of the service and then they come back into the service to engage with that same piece of content again. This person must really, really like that piece of content. We should give them more and more of that. So there's this almost a situation where the more you try to combat that content as a user, you might actually be increasing the likelihood that you're going to see more and more of it, even if you're trying to indicate that you don't like it or you don't trust it. Okay, could you go back one slide? Thank you. Now, this cycle is frustrating and is a bad user experience. But given that platforms tend to evaluate the effectiveness of product changes in the short-term experiments, often 1 or 2 weeks, all they see is that each new product change increases engagement in that time period. And increased engagement means more money for them, which makes them happy. And that is often where the decision is made. Okay, let's launch this algorithmic change. Let's launch this new feature. And that is a cycle that continues on and on. So they like that, at least in the short term. Now, there have been a small number of long-term experiments at a few of the very large online platforms that suggest after enough frustrating experiences with harmful content, users start to disengage with the platform. I mean, you can imagine if you go to a grocery store and the employees at that one grocery store start throwing literal bags of potato chips at you, that at first that might be novel, might be kind of fun, but then you're like, oh, I really don't want to play dodgeball with a bunch of people working in a grocery store throwing potato chip bags at me. That's a bad experience. I'd rather go to a place where maybe a server will hand me a bag if I ask for it, but they're not assaulting me with it when I walk through those doors. Now, in these long-term experiments that some of these platforms have run, they found that users, they start to disengage with the platform over a long enough time horizon. So when uh, it, in these experiments, they also will often have some sort of a comparison condition where users might have gotten the latest and greatest protections from harmful content, spam demotions, or try to serve people more diverse content, or information from high quality sources. Um, those people, they might not show that increased engagement in the first couple of weeks, but it's not because they're not getting a better product. It takes there's a cascading effect when you have these large social networks and there's so many billions of pieces of content, where you might not see the benefits initially, and uh, at the same time, if you're demoting or removing content that is harmful, and we know that people are disproportionately likely to engage that harmful content, then what happens is you're removing the thing that causes people to spend more time on the platform in the short run, even if it's going to cost them engagement, say 6 months from now. So typically these pro-integrity or trust and safety or harm-reducing models, they tend to show short-term regressions when it comes to user engagement, which often freaks these companies out, and may actually lead to them not launching some things that would really be beneficial to the users. Now, one of the recommendations our working group proposes is not measuring algorithmic success in short-term experiments with simple engagement signals, but rather with long-term user value. Next slide, please. Now, we define long-term user value as outcomes aligned with deliberate forward-looking preferences and aspirations of users. There are a lot of ways that we could estimate what users value, and one straightforward way is simply asking them, what kinds of content do they want to see the most in their feeds? What do they hope to get from that social media platform? Are they there to learn some new dance moves? Or who is running for office? Are they there primarily to keep in touch with friends and family who live far away? What people value varies considerably across people and across platforms. Determining what users value can even be based on some types of engagement signals. Yes, you heard me right, engagement signals. Not simple things like likes or comments that people can do kind of mindlessly, which are kind of ripe for manipulation and exploitation, but rather more deliberative and effortful engagement. For example, replacing likes with actual watch duration may be a better indicator that the user values that content and is not simply virtue signaling, or is not simply spamming the like button, because they are actually, like, they are investing their valuable time to consume the video, whether it's a minute or 10 minutes or an hour in some cases. That is probably a more helpful indicator of what they really value. Okay, next slide. It in recent years, a number of alternatives to these engagement-based recommendation systems have emerged. I'll go through some of these next. So the most commonly proposed alternative is probably the chronological feed or the reverse chronological feed. And this sounds good. And for those of us old enough to have been around for the earlier days of social media, 20 years ago, um, that this was what the early feeds included, but the social media and people's online presence has changed dramatically over those couple of decades, and now there's just so, like, people like regular users, they often will create less content than they used to, but there's also a lot of other accounts, not necessarily regular users, but say like a news outlet, or companies, or creators, influencers. And what this means is that there's just an inordinate amount of content out there. And if you just go with a chronological feed, you end up showing a lot of the content from these people or pages or outlets that are not your friends, not your family, because most of your friends and family are probably not posting multiple times a day. But say a news outlet might, or somebody trying to be an influencer and monetize their time on these platforms, they might be posting multiple times a day. And what that leads to is not this idyllic feed of that existed maybe 2 years ago, or 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but rather a feed that's filled with I don't know, Mr. Beast and Business Insider and a bunch of these other platforms that post a lot, and you might not ever see anything from your friends or family unless you get lucky. Now, they can also have, oh, back, thank you. They can also have peculiar effects, like showing you a lot more spam content. Because again, if people are making their livelihood on these platforms, then they will go and create content following whatever rules they learn from the system of how to get their content in front of people. So you end up like these experiences, or this type of recommendation system incentivizes spammy behavior, because that's the way to get your content in front of more people. So that's not great either. And in the experiments where these platforms have switched users to a chronological feed, users really, really dislike them. So they sound nice, but typically these types of feeds are not very popular among users, and they don't accomplish what I think some people allege that they do. Now, another common proposed alternative is non-personalized feeds. This ends up feeling random because the platform is serving you content that is not stuff that you're likely to be interested in, but rather stuff that the largest groups on the platform are interested in, because they're just trying to serve you something that is likely to be engaged with. And if they can't personalize that to you, they're going to just show you the most popular stuff. So this could actually worsen some of these problems, because it's not accounting for your particular interest, and it's just showing you the content that's getting the most amount of engagement on the platform already. So that could make things much worse. And on the other hand, or maybe in other words, users tend to prefer personalized feeds because the content is actually relevant to them and of their interest. I think TikTok's For You page is a good example of a personalized feed that was exceptionally good at showing users content that was uniquely of interest to them. And many other platforms have kind of followed suit, trying to generate a For You type of experience. So that's one indicator that non-personalized feeds are maybe not as great as they might sound at face value. Now, our working group identified better alternatives to engagement-based recommendation systems that are more likely to provide a good user experience. Now, one of these types of recommendation systems is what we might call like bridging-based algorithms. And these algorithms, they tend to evaluate content on how different people evaluate the same content and incentivize the content that diverse groups of people like. For example, if people on the political left and right both value a particular piece of content, then that content could be described as bridging a political division. And that could be seen as beneficial to society and to individuals having to engage with each other. But it also has the side effect of boosting higher quality content to people. And part of this is could be thought of as kind of like this idea of wisdom of crowds, or wisdom of diverse crowds, where lots of research going back decades and decades shows that when you have diverse people or diverse groups all agree that something is really good, that thing is much more likely to be truthful, be accurate, be uh, high quality than if only unique bubbles of people or very highly similar homogeneous groups think very positively of it, whereas other people disagree with that. So this approach is particularly effective at combating misinformation, toxicity, and a lot of the other harms that we see online that might kind of grow in these echo chambers where people are communicating primarily with people that are similar to them and not getting not reaching across different boundaries. Now, another type is survey-based. Survey-based systems require asking users to say, like, do they like the content? Do they uh, want more or less of something? And one example of this is Facebook. Facebook is asking a survey question. I think it's like every 30 or 70 posts, asking users whether they'd like to see more or less of content like that. That has a benefit to users, and it's a very direct signal of like, oh, this is good, this is not. And the last type I'll mention is quality-based systems. These are tricky because quality is pretty subjective, and like you could estimate the quality of, say, a news outlet based on the number of award-winning journalists they have, or maybe the number of other like higher quality outlets that link to them or share their content. You could also think of ways of trying to evaluate individual characteristics of content by whether it contains curse words or toxic language. And Google's Perspective API is one that's really like open and has been around for a while. It does a great job. You could also imagine using large language models and some of these other newer types of technologies to evaluate features of that content. Like, is this content using like proper language? Is it like calling people names or using 4-letter words? All of that could be used in a quality-based model. But again, quality-based models are tricky because they are inherently very, very subjective and require kind of a top-down determination of like, okay, this is what we value and this is what we don't value. Now, all right, I'll pass it back to Alyssa.
Thanks so much, Matt. That was a great foundation to understand the guidelines that I'm about to talk about. So I'm going to launch into the core policy guidance, which is explained in more detail in our report, which is on the KGI website, kgi.georgetown.edu. It's right there, linked from the homepage. And I would also encourage people, if you have questions for Matt or for myself as we're going through, please put them in the Q&A panel in the webinar. If we could go back one slide, please. What is the core policy guidance? The core policy guidance is really a roadmap of mutually reinforcing guidelines that are all built around that concept of long-term user value that Matt spoke about just a few minutes ago. And our goal with putting it together is really to promote designs of these recommender systems that address harms that people are legitimately concerned about, while also preserving the benefits that really thoughtful use of some types of engagement data can offer, as well as thoughtful use of personalization. So really trying to kind of open up that design space and strike that middle ground. This core policy guidance was developed with the US legal jurisdiction in mind. It's guidance, it's not legislative language. So if that's what you are coming to this webinar for, you're going to be disappointed. Obviously, developing legislative language would require a lot of nuance and a lot more detail. But in developing the guidance, we did want to be attentive to concerns about the potential for, regulation that might take up some of these ideas to implicate speech rights under the First Amendment, as well as platform liability immunity under Section 230. So this guidance you can think of in the US context. We tried very deliberately to be thinking about those constraints, but it is by no means legislative language. Next slide, please. So the core policy guidance is divided into essentially three buckets: design transparency, user choices and defaults, and assessments of long-term impact. And again, these are meant to be really mutually reinforcing. They're sort of components that amount to a whole. I'm going to tick through each of them. And luckily for you all and our human brains, we have three categories and we have three guidelines in each category. So it should be pretty simple to follow along. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with design transparency. So the motivation for thinking about transparency and what more we could do here is that when we look across at the existing disclosures from platform companies about how their recommender systems work, there are some limited public disclosures about how these systems work already, and there have been for many years. Some of these taken up voluntarily by platform companies originally. Some of them are now required in particular jurisdictions, specifically in the European Union as a result of the Digital Services Act. So it's not that there aren't any disclosures out there about how these systems work, but as a general matter, the disclosures that are out there tend to be deficient in a few ways. They tend to lack information about which kinds of inputs and signals that go into these recommender systems are weighted more heavily. They tend to not really address how these systems make use of predictions, what they're predicting, and which of those predictions are most important. And they tend not to really focus on the metrics that are used to judge the success of the recommender systems. And so what we found is that more detailed disclosures are needed in order for outside experts, regulators, and the public to be able to understand the trade-offs that are being made in the design of recommender systems. Now, everything that I'm going to talk about today, it's not meant to all be consumed by the layperson. It's not, the kind of disclosure that like we expect every internet user to go look at these and fully understand how these systems work. Some of these are really meant for independent experts and evaluators to be able to judge how these systems are working and how they compare to each other. So I'll go through each of these in turn, and I'm going to start with input data sources and weights. We can look at the next slide. Here's an example, actually, of an existing disclosure. This is from the Transparency Center that Meta hosts on its website and specifically is focused on Instagram. And to its credit, Meta lists dozens and dozens of predictions that it makes across more than 30 different algorithmic systems that it has designed and deployed. And for each of those predictions, it lists some of the signals that feed in and are incorporated into that prediction. So this one in particular is related to the main Instagram feed, and it's about how likely you are to spend more than 10 seconds on the first post. So this is one of the predictions that Meta is incorporating into Instagram, and it's showing you some of the signals that that are influential in formulating this prediction. So this is helpful. It's like a useful point of transparency, but it's not really comprehensive enough for an independent analyst to be able to understand how the system is working and what it's valuing. Next slide, please. So what we propose in our guideline around input data sources and weights is that platforms disclose all sources of raw information that are used in ranking. What are the categories of information that actually go into formulating how we rank different items in the recommender? And there's a lot of different ones of those categories. You can see them listed on the slide, like things about the content, about engagement history, about the user profile, social graph, context, lots of different things. We're saying that full list of all of those sources should be disclosed. We're also saying that weights related to the values that go into the system should be disclosed. Now, most recommender systems rely on some set of weights that are applied to some set of values in the system. I'm not going to go into more detail than that. These systems are designed in a variety of different ways, and there's some more technical info in the report if that's your jam. But basically what we're saying here is that all of these systems have some set of weights which reveal which values have a greater or less impact on the ranking. And those should be disclosed basically in a relative way using this concept of the quartile that allows independent experts to understand which ones are more important and which values are less important. And we do that in a relative way, this quartile system, as a way to acknowledge that companies might find these to be business sensitive or trade secret. So we're not saying you have to, lift the veil entirely and show the world everything, but tell us a little bit more about how those weights are relative to each other. Next slide, please. So that's the first guide, the transparency guideline. The second one focuses on metrics that are used to measure long-term value, and this one is pretty straightforward. Matt talked about this concept of long-term value and trying to overall incentivize companies to optimize for it more. What we're saying is, if you had to disclose the metrics that you use to measure long-term value, then you would have to have them. So that's really kind of the motivating factor behind this one, is by saying we have to disclose these, then they would have to be developed. It would also really enlighten cross-industry comparisons about how key metrics of interest are measured within different platforms. And here I'm just going to call out something which is common to our approach across all of these guidelines, which is that there's a lot of flexibility in the framework. We're not saying you have to design your recommender this way, you have to do a chronological feed, you have to do this or that. We're not saying any of that. We're saying optimize for long-term value. The way that you get there as a platform is up to you, and it's going to vary because platforms serve different audiences, they serve different purposes. But afterward, explain how it is that you got there and how you measure whether users are achieving their long-term preferences and feeling satisfied with the platform. And then the third one, you can go to the next slide, is metrics that are used to evaluate the teams that are responsible for recommender systems. So if we look at these systems of big platforms, there are potentially thousands of metrics associated with a single platform product. How do we know which ones are important? If you require the disclosure of them all, we would all be lost in a sea of metrics. But every company has a way of setting objectives and measuring employee and team performance against those objectives. If you go to the next slide, we can see, one of the common ways that's done probably in the tech industry and probably in other industries too, is to use this system called objectives and key results, or OKRs, where, teams will have a concrete and clearly defined goal for the quarter, the half, the year. And then together with those, we'll have a small number of measurable and typically quantifiable success criteria, or what we call key results, the KRs. So what we're saying is that for teams that have, some set of objectives and metrics, maybe it uses an OKR framework or maybe it doesn't. Those are the metrics that need to be disclosed in order to understand what the company running the platform is prioritizing in the design of its recommender. If all of those metrics are about engagement, how many eyeballs do we have on this platform? What are our daily active users like? What is watch time like? Then we'll know that that's what the platform is prioritizing, because that's what all the teams are driving toward. If some of those are different and they're more about user satisfaction, user benefit, and so on, that would be very telling. So that's sort of the motivation for saying these metrics should be disclosed. Next slide, please. So the second category is user choices and defaults. Now, we know it is very hard to make user choices and settings functional on online platforms and mobile apps. We are not blind to the fact that ease of use of settings is very tricky, and that in general on these platforms, all settings, all controls do not see much uptake at all. Most users, don't change anything from the defaults. But we felt that user choices and defaults are an important part of a broader package. And so, as I said, these are sort of mutually reinforcing guidelines. We don't think that choices are a silver bullet, but they're important to have as part of the package. So the first guideline here is that recommender systems need to have platforms need to have an easily accessible choice of recommender systems, and at least one of those needs to be optimized to support long-term user value. Again, here, we're not mandating any particular approach. We're saying users should be able to have a choice, and at least one of those choices should specifically be the one that reflects their long-term preferences and aspirations. If we go to the next slide, we can look at a little example. So I think Looking out at the platforms that are available today, one of the examples of a platform that is offering sort of lots of choices is Blue Sky. So what we see here is on the right side, there's a user interface where you can select additional feeds. You can add feeds into your Blue Sky app. This is my selection of feeds. All I do is internet policy and I follow gymnastics, so that's what I have in mind. But then when you're in the app, it's easy to switch between these different potential feeds. And so conceptually, how we map that onto the guideline in our report is for other platforms, if we had sort of a default feed that was optimized however the platform is perhaps optimizing it today. And then we would have an additional one that's optimized for long-term user value or vice versa. Now, unlike a sort of simple chronological or non-personalized feed being sort of the fallback option or the second option, what we're saying is that this option requires the platform to take deliberate steps to orient their system around long-term value. And Matt talked about some of the ways that platforms can do that by actually soliciting long-term preferences from users, by extrapolating from survey data, by relying on quality indicators that users provide, by relying on those engagement signals that are more clear or require more effort or more effortful. I love that word. So where users really have to invest in order to, write a really long comment or make a big purchase, these kinds of signals that really reflect in a clear way the user's intent. There's a variety of different ways that these long-term oriented feeds could be built, and we're not saying anything about how any platform should do that. There's flexibility there, but that's what this option is meant to provide. Next slide, please. So the second guideline for user choice is actually pretty much like dead simple. It's to honor users' preferences. A common complaint about existing user controls is that they do not really serve to enhance users' sense of agency. And even for the small fraction of users who do engage with controls, they often appear to have little or no effect. So for those who have looked around in their user interfaces, in their social media apps, you've probably seen screens like the ones we're showing here, where you can say, you're interested or not interested in the content, don't suggest posts that look like this or that, this content makes me feel a certain way, and so on. There's lots of these interfaces out there. The issue that we find is that users can't discern an impact of having used these settings and preferences. They don't feel that they're being acted on. So this guideline is really to say, when the user tells you more of this content, less of that content, block this, recommend that, that those preferences actually be honored. Next slide, please. And then the last one is specific to minors. So I talked about there being an easily accessible choice, at least one option for long-term value. And for minors specifically, what we propose is that that option be set as the default. There's a legitimate concern that offering a choice does not really go far enough to protect these users, given their stage of cognitive and social emotional development. And so to the extent that platforms are able to use, explicit preferences and settings, survey information, guidance from and evidence from public health authorities or other tools to be able to discern what's in the long-term interest of the minor user or what they value in the long term, then that's the option that should be made as the default. If that's not possible or the platform doesn't have that data or is unwilling to collect it in a privacy protective way, then what we suggest is that the fallback be to a non-personalized option. This is not ideal. Matt talked all about how, the value of personalization, and we examine that to some extent in our report. So the fallback being a non-personalized option is meant to be an incentive for platforms to develop a better option. That if what we have to fall back to is non-personalized, we should be incentivized to really figure out how we can tune these feeds in the long-term interests of minor users, instead of falling back to a non-personalized option. Next slide, please. All right, so our third category of guidelines here all relate to assessments of long-term impact, and Matt did a great job of teeing this up a bit. We know that platforms can only deliver long-term value to users if they continuously test the impact of algorithmic changes over time. And so this set of recommendations really focuses on how long-term value can be assessed, what needs to be reported for public accountability, and how we can be assured of the robustness of the assessments that are taking place. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about the intuition behind this notion of long-term assessment and long-term holdouts before getting into the guidelines specifically. So platforms run lots of experiments all the time. Matt can tell us, how many hundreds or thousands of them are probably being run simultaneously. And a lot of those last a week or 2 weeks, sometimes a month. Some of them last longer, but lots of them are short term. And the issue that comes into play when platforms start experimenting with changes that might increase value overall or might increase value for users in the longer term is that sometimes they can reduce engagement or attention in the short run. And so if we only run experiments for a short amount of time, these look like failures because engagement is going down. There's less sort of salacious content, there's less extreme content. People aren't being drawn into the platform for as many minutes, hours per day or week. And these experiments look like they have failed because engagement has gone down. But if the experiments were allowed to run for a longer period of time, what we might see over the long term, or what I think many people internally do see, is that when we start to ask users about how they feel about the platform later, is it giving them what they want? Are they happy with their experience? Are they having, how much regret are they having about what they see on there? Those values would start to be producing better results over a longer time period if those experiments could be run for longer. It's risky for platforms to commit to a long-term experiment if the initial short-term results suggest that the intervention is making things worse. And so, moving on to the next slide. What we suggest is that platforms run what we call long-term holdout experiments for 12 months or more, wherein they maintain a holdout group, which is a group of users that are exempt from having their design changes applied to their accounts, and who function as basically a control group for comparison with the rest of the user base or with the sort of the product group. And these already happen in the industry in many cases, and you can see some different examples from different companies on the slide. But if these long-term experiments were to become institutionalized, then they could become really powerful tools to shift platforms' incentives towards designs that optimize for long-term retention and satisfaction. So that's why we, even though some of these already exist in some companies, we could see a much wider scale of these being institutionalized across the industry, and that would just put more focus on user value in the long term. Next slide, please. The last two guidelines here are meant to sort of reinforce this recommendation around long-term experiments. The first one is to report the aggregate anonymized results of these experiments publicly, and the second one is to have them subjected to an independent audit. And these are both sort of keys to the accountability. So if the results in the aggregate, again, not totally anonymized, non-personalized results, are being reported, then the companies have an incentive to make sure that those metrics and what they're measuring in the product group are better than in the holdout group. If the holdout group doesn't get any changes applied to the design of the product for a whole year, and yet it's still a happier group at the end of that year, then we know that those changes that are getting applied to the product aren't really having the effect on users that, as a public we would want. So that's sort of the intuition behind why do we want to have these results reported. And auditability is really important to avoid gamesmanship in the design of these experiments. Next slide, please. So that's the end of the core policy guidance focused on the US legal context. The report also contains some guidance in thinking more about a global policy context where there might be a sort of different legal frameworks in play and where we might have a little bit more flexibility in terms of some of the policy levers that are available. So for the global guidance, we touch on a few additional items, public content disclosures, talking about continuously publishing a sample of the most highly disseminated content on the platform, and also representative sample of a typical user session on the platform. For the global audience, we take our guideline for minors that we had in the US, and we expand it to the full population and basically say, let's make that long-term user value option the default. And then we also talk about reporting of aggregate harms for at-risk populations. There's been some of this measurement in a systematic way of how users are experiencing the platforms, whether they're experiencing unwanted contact or content or harmful usage. There's ways to track these things in a systematic way that could become more institutionalized with more reporting requirements. So that's the global policy guidance. Just in terms of next steps, and then we're going to turn to questions really quickly. We're very excited to engage with anyone who's interested in this this roadmap that we've put out. So please feel free to email me. My email address is on the slide, and we're happy to follow up with anyone who's engaging with this work. We also have some more products in the pipeline. We're developing some modular legislative language that could help inform legislation. We're developing a mapping of these guidelines onto the implementation requirements under the Digital Services Act. And we're also looking to collect examples where the guidelines have been implemented in practice in the industry. So feel free to reach out on any of those counts or any others. And now we're going to turn to Q&A. Let me see if I have a good question teed up. If someone on the team has a question teed up. So I think the first question for Q&A is about the concept of bridging and trade-offs from adopting alternative designs that promote long-term user value. What are some of the trade-off? What might some of the trade-offs be, and how can we balance them with the benefits of engagement? Good question for you, Matt.
Yes, that's a great question. I think one of the challenges of any of the bridging-based approaches is that it requires platforms to have information on who their users are, and this is not something that they don't have. But there is certainly some consideration that should be given to like data privacy and user privacy, because in order to try to bridge boundaries, the platform has to know what boundaries are being bridged and what the identities of those users are. So there are lots of ways that this can be done, and at some platforms, it's just a measure of like, okay, how different are these different platforms or different users? So this could be something as simple as like looking at device IDs, like, okay, so these cell phone numbers or these IP addresses that they're located in a certain region, and oh, the device language is set to English or French or Chinese or whatever, and then you can take the like kind of like count up the number of differences there, or come up with some vector math to differentiate users in that way, and that's an effective approach that some platforms have used, at least in some kind of small use cases. But that is one challenge of using that type of a system. And then I think there's also some concern about like, okay, well, how do you define similar, dissimilar? Like, are like it's a kind of a complex situation. So some people might be apprehensive about like, oh, like diversity, you're trying to show stuff that diverse people like. Does that mean that it's like, oh, pro DEI or whatever? And that takes it in a very different direction than what it actually is in practice, which is just different. So I'll stop there.
That's great. And I know we're right at the hour, so we'll take just one more question. We got a lot of questions about long-term user value and whether in our research we came across or developed a sort of best practice for what long-term means, or whether it's platform dependent. So I would say we got as far as focusing on the longer term, forward-looking aspirations and preferences of the user. That was sort of like how we encapsulate the concept in our work, but it doesn't get a lot more specific than that, and certainly not in terms of like, how far into the future does that need to be. Matt talked about the potato chip problem, and this sort of derives from the two systems or two minds model of thinking that has emerged over the decades in psychology and behavioral science. And so we're kind of tee off of that and make the distinction between what is forward-looking and deliberative versus what is sort of impulsive and short-term. And we see that distinction in the data that the platforms can gather. But we didn't get any more concrete in terms of, specifically, this is how long-term is, and this is how short-term is. And as I said, part of what we tried to do is leave things flexible so that platforms themselves, which have very different modalities and affordances, can make their own determinations about how they measure that long-term value, and how they effectuate it in the platform. I know we got a ton of other questions, and unfortunately we are running over time. So we will definitely take the questions back for those of you who are already connected with. For those who are not, please feel free to send us email. You can email me, alyssa.cooper@georgetown.edu, or KGI-media, which is listed on our website as well. We'd love to follow up and answer more questions, and just hear what you all think of the work. So thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your engagement. And if you ever want to look back at the report, the slides, or the recording, they'll be available on our website.